Have you ever wondered what happens when the shooting finally stops? We often view history through the lens of the victors, the liberation, the strategy, the heroism of the assault. But on the morning of June 6, 1944, thousands of young men stormed the beaches of Normandy, running directly into a storm of steel unlike anything the world had ever seen. At the center of that storm was a single weapon, the Maschinengewehr 42, known to the German troops as Die Knochensäge, the bone saw, and to the terrified Allies, Hitler's buzzsaw. To the men on the beach, it was a sound, a terrifying ripping noise that meant instant death. To the men behind the gun, it was a desperate lifeline, the only tool they had to hold back an entire invasion force, hour after grueling hour. But eventually, the ammunition ran out. The barrels melted, the bunkers were flanked, and for the German gunners who had spent the morning mowing down hundreds of American, British, and Canadian soldiers, the moment of reckoning arrived. What happens to a man who finally raises his hands after inflicting that much carnage? Does he get mercy, or does he get revenge? Today we are going beyond the specifications and the nicknames. We are going to walk you through the D-Day experience from the other side of the firing slit, from the mechanics of the weapon that defined the battle, to the psychological horror of the men pulling the trigger, and finally, to the dark, often unspoken fate that awaited them when the Allies finally broke through. To understand the fate of these gunners, you first have to understand the weapon that made them such high-priority targets. By 1944, the MG-42 was the backbone of the German infantry. It was a marvel of engineering that was years ahead of its time. While Allied machine guns like the American Browning M1919 or the British Bren fired at a steady, thumping rhythm of about 500 to 600 rounds per minute, the MG-42 was in a league of its own. It fired at a cyclic rate of 1,200 to 1,500 rounds per minute. That is 25 bullets every single second. At that speed, the human ear cannot distinguish individual shots. There is no rat-a-tat-tat. There is only a continuous, tearing roar. Veterans often described it as the sound of canvas being ripped apart, or a giant chainsaw cutting through dry wood. It was a sound designed to suppress the enemy, not just physically, but psychologically. When an MG-42 opened up, you didn't just duck, you froze. But this power came with a price. The weapon was a beast to operate. The immense friction generated by that rate of fire would heat the barrel to dangerous levels in seconds. If a gunner fired a continuous burst for too long, the barrel could glow red hot, warp, destroy the gun. This meant the German machine gun crew, typically 3 men, had to operate like a pit crew at a racetrack. The gunner, Schütze 1, aimed and fired. The assistant gunner, Schütze 2, fed the ammunition belts, and crucially, helped swap the barrel. Every 200 to 250 rounds, they had to stop. The gunner would pop a latch, the hot barrel would swing out, and the assistant would slot in a fresh, cool one using an asbestos glove. A well-drilled crew could do this in under 5 seconds. Those 5 seconds were the only window of safety the Allies had to move. On D-Day, these crews were the linchpin of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Atlantic Wall. Rommel knew he couldn't match the Allies in the air or at sea. His only chance was to stop the invasion at the water's edge. He ordered the construction of wider stands nester, resistance nests. These weren't just random foxholes. They were complex systems of concrete bunkers, Tobruk pits, and trenches, all connected by tunnels and telephone lines. Crucially, they were designed for what is known as enfilade fire. This meant the guns weren't pointed directly out to sea. If you looked at the beach from a boat, you might not even see the bunker's opening. Instead, they were angled to fire down the length of the beach. This protected the gunners from naval shelling, but it created a deadly trap for the infantry. As Allied soldiers ran forward, they weren't facing one gun. They were walking sideways into a wall of bullets coming from their flanks. On Omaha Beach alone, there were 15 of these major strongpoints. Inside them, the gunners waited. Some were battle-hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had seen the horrors of Stalingrad. Others were teenagers, or conscripts from occupied countries like Poland or Russia, forced into service. But on the morning of June 6th, their orders were identical. Stay at your post and fire until the invasion is crushed, or until you are dead. As the sun rose on June 6th, the horizon filled with ships. For a young German gunner staring out of a concrete slit, the sight was overwhelming. It looked as though an entire world was coming to kill him. The Allied naval bombardment began, a thunderous barrage intended to smash these bunkers to pieces. But concrete is stubborn. While the shelling terrified the defenders and disrupted their communications, many of the pillboxes remained intact. The men inside shook off the dust, loaded their belts, and waited. Then, the ramps dropped. This is where the training kicked in. The German doctrine was efficient and brutal. Gunners were taught tactics like mowing the grass. They kept their aim low, at knee height, waist height. The logic was grim. A soldier shot in the legs would fall and need help. When a medic or a buddy rushed to save him, the gunner had two more targets. Let's look at the story of one specific man to understand this experience. Heinrich Severloh, later known to history as the Beast of Omaha. Severloh was a 20-year-old corporal stationed at Strong Point WN-62, overlooking the easy red and fox green sectors of Omaha Beach. His commanding officer gave him a specific order. Don't open fire while they are still in the boats. Wait until they reach the knee-deep water. Then, you won't miss. Severloh waited. He watched the Americans wade through the surf, weighed down by heavy gear, seasick, disoriented. And then, he squeezed the trigger. For the next 9 hours, Severloh did not stop. He fired belt after belt of ammunition. When his MG-42 became too hot to touch, he swapped barrels. When he ran out of machine gun ammo, he picked up a rifle. By his own account, he fired over 12,000 rounds that day. The piles of hot brass casings grew so high around his feet, they began to burn his boots. From the gunner's perspective, this wasn't a battle in the traditional sense. It was a mechanical process. Load, fire, change barrel, repeat. But psychologically, a strange detachment often took over. Many German veterans later spoke of a tunnel vision. They stopped seeing the invaders as human beings. They were just shapes in the distance. The noise, the smoke, the adrenaline. It created a barrier between the act of killing and the reality of it. But for the men on the beach, there was no detachment. There was only horror. Units like a company of the 116th Infantry were decimated within minutes of the ramps dropping. Men were cut in half before they even touched dry sand. The water turned red, and the sound of the MG-42 became the soundtrack of their nightmare. However, no position is invincible forever. The Allied plan had failed in the first hour. The tanks that were supposed to support the infantry had mostly sunk. The aerial bombing had missed the bunkers. The soldiers on the beach realized that if they stayed where they were, they would die. So small groups of men began to improvise. This is where the battle shifted. It wasn't won by generals on maps. It was won by individual sergeants and privates who crawled forward, inch by inch. They noticed the pauses. They counted the seconds during the barrel changes. They screamed at their men to move while the German assistant gunner was fumbling with hot steel. They scrambled over the seawall, found the dead zones between the bunker's fields of fire. Slowly, painfully, the Allies began to infiltrate the trench networks behind the guns. Inside the pillboxes, the mood began to change. The German gunners, who had felt like masters of the battlefield at 7 in the morning, were feeling trapped by noon. They started receiving reports that Americans were behind them. The telephone lines were dead. The ammunition was running low. The invincible Atlantic Wall was leaking. The fight for the bunkers was vicious. Allied troops used flamethrowers, satchel charges, grenades. For the MG-42 crew, the concrete walls that protected them from the front now became their tomb. Imagine the terror, being inside a small, dark room, the air thick with cordite smoke, hearing the thump of enemy boots on the roof above you. You know they are looking for the ventilation shafts. You know a grenade is coming next. This was the moment of decision. Do you fight to the death, or do you try to surrender? For many, the choice was taken out of their hands. A satchel charge thrown through the firing slit would end the debate instantly. But for those who were still alive, when the Americans kicked down the door, they faced the most dangerous few seconds of their lives. Surrendering in the middle of a high-intensity battle is never safe. Surrendering when you are an MG-42 gunner who has just wiped out an entire platoon, that is a gamble with very poor odds. D-Day was not a clean war. It was messy, emotional, fueled by rage. By the laws of war, the Geneva Convention, prisoners were supposed to be treated humanely, and in many cases, they were. Thousands of Germans were captured on D-Day, marched to the beach, shipped to England. But there are dark chapters to this story that are often left out of the history books. American Gias had just watched their best friends die in the surf. They had seen bodies torn apart by the very weapon now sitting silent in the corner of the bunker. When the man behind that gun stood up, hands raised, many Allied soldiers couldn't see a prisoner. They only saw a murderer. There are numerous verified accounts of machine gunners being shot out of hand immediately after surrendering. One veteran of the 29th Infantry Division recalled in an interview years later, "We were told not to take prisoners initially. We didn't have the men to guard them, and we were angry. If a guy had been killing us for 4 hours, he didn't get to just say, 'I quit,' and walk away." This was especially true for snipers and MG-42 crews. The hatred for these specific roles was intense because their killing felt personal, precise, relentless. The uniform mattered too. Most of the coastal defenders were regular Wehrmacht army troops. But if a soldier was identified as SS, or if he was wearing the black Panzer uniform, which was often mistaken for SS, his chances of survival dropped significantly. In the heat of the moment, with adrenaline pumping and blood on the sand, the line between justice and vengeance blurred. There is a famous account from a Canadian sector. A German officer surrendered after his position was overrun. He walked out with his hands up, but he was still wearing his pistol. In the tension of the moment, a Canadian soldier shot him. It wasn't always malice. Sometimes it was pure, reactive fear, but often it was retribution. The logic of the frontline soldier is different from the logic of a courtroom. If you kill my brother, I kill you. However, we must also acknowledge the humanity that did survive amidst the slaughter. There are stories of medics, like those at the church in Ongoville-Plain, who treated wounded Americans and Germans side by side. There were moments where a gunner would raise his hands, and a GI, despite his shaking hands and blinding anger, would lower his rifle and motion for him to move to the rear. But for the gunner, those seconds of staring down the barrel of an M1 Garand were an eternity. Back at WN-62, Heinrich Severloh realized his position was being overrun. His ammunition was gone. His commander, Lieutenant Firking, was killed while trying to retreat. Severloh was wounded, but he managed to scramble back through the hedgerows. He didn't surrender at his gun. He surrendered the next day, further inland, where he could blend in with other prisoners. He was smart enough not to tell anyone he was the man behind the machine gun at Easy Red. If he had, it is almost certain he would not have survived the day. So, what happened to the ones who survived? They were shipped to prisoner of war camps in the United States, Britain, and Canada. For many, and this was a shock, they had been told by Nazi propaganda that the Allies were monsters who would torture them. Instead, they found themselves in camps where they were fed well, given medical treatment, put to work on farms. For a young German boy who had been starving on rations, the food in an American POW camp was a revelation. But while their bodies were safe, their minds were often still back in the bunkers. You cannot fire a weapon like the MG-42 at human beings for hours on end without it leaving a mark on your soul. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not a term used back then. They called it shell shock, combat fatigue. But the German gunners carried it just as the Allied survivors did. They had nightmares of the screaming, of the tracers, of the faces of the men they killed. For decades, men like Heinrich Severloh stayed silent. They returned to a Germany that was destroyed. They rebuilt their lives, became farmers, shopkeepers, fathers. But they rarely spoke of D-Day. The guilt was complex. They had been doing their duty as soldiers, defending their positions. But the scale of the death they inflicted was a heavy burden. They were the villains of history, and they knew it. It wasn't until nearly 40 years later that Severloh finally told his story. He actually sought out the survivors. He wanted to know the names of the men he had shot at. In a remarkable twist of fate, he located David Silva, an American soldier who had been wounded on Omaha Beach, quite possibly by Severloh's own gun. They met in Germany. The old enemies hugged. They cried. It was a moment of closure that few veterans ever got. Severloh said, "I have thought about that day, every single day of my life. I did not want to be in that war. I did not want to be in that bunker." The story of the MG-42 gunner is uncomfortable. It forces us to look at the enemy, not just as a target, but as a human being caught in the gears of a terrible machine. It reminds us that on D-Day, there were teenagers on both sides of the wall, both terrified, both trying to survive. The MG-42 is often remembered for its specs. We obsess over the rate of fire, the engineering, the cool factor of military technology. It is still considered one of the best machine guns ever made. In fact, its direct descendant, the MG3, is still used by militaries around the world today. The DNA of Hitler's Buzzsaw lives on. But when we look at D-Day, we must remember that weapons are operated by men. On one side, young men terrified of dying, pushing forward into a hail of bullets to liberate a continent. On the other, young men terrified of failing, locked in concrete boxes, pulling triggers until their fingers bled. The fate of the MG-42 gunner was a grim one. He was the most feared man on the battlefield, and often the most hated. He fought with the desperation of someone who knew that surrender might not be an option. And when the guns finally fell silent on the evening of June 6th, the beaches were left to the dead, and the ghosts of the men who had to live with what they had done. This history serves as a stark reminder of the brutality of combat. It strips away the glory and leaves only the raw, human cost of war. Whether they died in their bunkers, were executed in the heat of passion, or lived for decades with the ghosts of the men they killed. The MG